Olá, caros ouvintes, sejam bem-vindos a mais episódio do vosso Podcast Conversa e hoje estou aqui com o Dave Lee, da Internacional dos Podcasts, o Dia Internacional dos Podcasts. So, Dave, welcome.
Claudio, thank you for having me on the podcast. Really looking forward to talking to you, and it's been a while, well, probably since last September since we actually connected and talked, at least in person, so it's really great to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you to the coronavirus.
It is real.
Oh man, that crazy stuff. So we are talking about all this new agenda we all have in our lives, thanks to the coronavirus, and the podcasts are no exception about this struggle to keep the views up, keep the audience entertained and stuff like that. You as the founder of the International Podcast Day, what's your feedback about this?
It's a very interesting time, Claudio, in the podcast space, just not here domestically in the United States where I am at, but also internationally. And I think whereas more data is starting to become light about what's going on in Portugal, Spain, Italy, European Union, there is a lot of data, of course, being, aggregated and sort of analyzed here in the United States. And it's interesting, we are seeing certain types of podcasts losing a certain percentage of their listening base. For one, my father and I do a tech podcast. Within the technology space, you're seeing a little bit of a decline. But there is some that have like an entrepreneurial-based podcast where they're actually seeing a steady, modified increase into theirs because their audience, of course, is entrepreneurs and tech leaders and people that work in e-commerce as a lifeline for them. And so for those reasons, they're kind of seeing a small incremental increase. You're seeing some increases for those that are like in the alternative health section and well-being and self-improvement as people are home more. They're struggling with complications with work and family and whatever's going on internationally with the coronavirus. And so people are trying to work on themselves, right? Trying to do some self-improvements, look at the health side of things. So you're seeing some increases there. Where you're actually seeing some decreases is in some of the like true crime podcasts. You're probably, obviously the political ones, you're seeing a large increase, but it depends sort of what industry.
Some of them.
Yes, some of them, exactly. Not all of them, some of them, but you're trying to, you're looking at different sort of genres of podcasts that are seeing some dips, right? Overall, it looks like that there is about a 13% decrease in downloads, which isn't honestly that bad. But I mean, when you're talking about millions of subscribers, billions over the world's landscape, it can be pretty significant. So it is really interesting to kind of see what's happening throughout the United States specifically. And I think most of it, Claudio, is because we're very habitual podcast listeners. I, for one, and this goes for a lot of people, we listen to podcasts on the way to work in your vehicle or on the train. Or when you're at your desk, you're sitting there listening. Now that most people are home, they're not taking the transit or they're not walking to work or driving their cars to work. You don't have that 30-minute hour break to listen both ways. Also, when you're home, you're easily distracted by animals, by kids, by spouses, by people in your household. And so it's just trying to readjust whatever habit and your new reality is. And then I think we're going to see the podcast listening stats start to creep up again. But yeah, really the coronavirus has really spun everybody into changing the habit, and habits are hard to break. And so when you have to readjust how you work, how you function in your life, I think that's really when you start to see these, slight modifications of increases or decreases around the style of podcast that you have.
Yeah. Portanto, aqui o Dave a dizer que, regra geral, tem havido um decréscimo de 30% de ouvir os podcasts, que tem havido podcasts como, por exemplo, os podcasts de crime, por exemplo, histórias de crime, têm estado a diminuir bastante. Alguns relacionados com política têm estado a subir, mas, como eu disse, nem todos, e já vou explicar o porquê que eu disse isso, mas que isto tudo se deve pelo facto da alteração das nossas rotinas. Portanto, nós já não fazemos aquele trajeto de meia hora para o trabalho, para a faculdade, ou já não nos sentamos tantas vezes à secretária a trabalhar quanto isso, e portanto perdemos alguns hábitos porque lá está, estamos em casa, estamos distraídos com crianças, com televisão, com animais, o que quer que seja, portanto já não temos os mesmos hábitos de consumo. So, Dave, I was interrupting you about the things like you were saying about the increasing of political podcasts, and I would like to stop you a little bit. Just I disagreed a little bit, just a little bit, about not all of them, because they are because all the politics around the world is kind of stopped, and or you speak about coronavirus in politics, or you don't have anything. And something I start to see in the other podcasts, and it will be something I will do with my podcast also, it's creating podcasts or material explaining politics. So much of the time, the politics podcast speak about what is the politics at the moment, a measure, a statement, or something like that, but they don't do like a podcast like what is politics, what is left, what is left wing, right wing, what is all the stuff, how the Congress works, how the Senate works, and stuff like that. And now I think that the podcasts who are growing up are those who speak always about the coronavirus, or introduce their listeners to terminology more specific about politics.
You'd bring up a really good point, because in each genre of podcast, in this case political podcast, you do have those divides, right? You have those that are trying to talk about the current state of politics in whatever state or country you're in, and that could be from any sort of policies to any sort of movements to any sort of decisions being made. And yeah, you do have this big push where you have hundreds of podcasters simply just talking about coronavirus, and that's connected to how a government has responded to it, how the healthcare system has responded to it, how international politics are playing a part in that. So I think you're exactly right, where you're not going to see a consistent increase for all political podcasts. Like you said, it's going to be a little bit fractured. You're going to see some increases here, some decreases here on the other side. And yeah, that's just the changing nature right now of podcasting. I think as the coronavirus slows and there's less spreading, people are going to get back to their routine of listening to certain things. Podcasters are going to start talking about a variety of topics again, and I know it's a very interesting time to be in podcasting. It's an interesting time to talk about politics. And right now, a lot of these things are simply fluid. We're trying to get through the process of being locked down or quarantined for up to 2, 3, 4 months at a time. And so, yeah, I think right now we're just trying to figure out how to do things. We have a lot of new podcasts. Just recently here in the United States, or Apple Podcast announced that they had 91,000 new podcasts submitted and approved in the month of April alone. And
last week we had the 1 million podcast, the number.
Exactly, yeah. Daniel J. Lewis has been tracking that and said we peaked over the 1 million mark of official podcast in Apple Podcast, and it's absolutely incredible. And that's a time, Claudio, where I think now that you're home, you have the time. A lot of creators are saying, let me take this time to do something creative. Let me connect with an audience. Let me talk about what I feel. And it's not just about coronavirus. We have a lot of fiction-based podcasts that are coming out, more true crime. You have a lot of health and wellness. You have a lot of companies that no longer can do things in person, like gyms or restaurants or entertainment. You're really seeing the entertainment sector of the podcast industry really increase. They don't have the new releases and the blockbuster hits to talk about, so they're diving into an older catalog of entertainment and reaching their audience that way. So one thing I've learned about podcasters in the podcasting industry is we're completely adaptable, we're completely flexible, and I think we're really seeing that within a lot of genres across the podcasting spectrum right now.
Portanto, estava a dizer então aqui ao Dave que realmente esta questão toda dos podcasts de política, nem todos estão em crescimento. Aqueles que estão, regra geral, em crescimento são aqueles que estão a fazer conteúdo relacionado com o coronavírus, portanto, que vão falando sobre aquilo que são as notícias referentes, e enfim, tem sido algo que eu tenho estado a fazer também, ou têm lançado conteúdo, que é algo que eu espero que quando este episódio sair já tenha feito para vocês também conteúdo relacionado com o que é a política, o que é a esquerda, o que é a direita, portanto, tudo isso, que é um bocado, apesar deste ser o maior podcast de política aqui em Portugal, sabemos que, por exemplo, eu trato-vos da política, mas nunca fiz um episódio que vos diga o que é o Parlamento, ou como é que funciona o Parlamento. Falo-vos sempre, explico-vos sempre, de acordo com o contexto de algo que foi criado. Portanto, está a ser criado muitos conteúdos nesse sentido também. E eu estava aqui a falar da componente também de muitos podcasts terem sido criados agora, na semana passada, portanto, estou a gravar no dia 3 de maio, na semana passada chegou-se ao podcast 1 milhão de podcasts oficiais pela Apple Podcasts, e, portanto, os próprios restaurantes, os próprios cosméticos, tudo isso têm estado a trabalhar muito através dos podcasts, portanto, como forma de chegar. Well, I created a platform of podcasts here in Portugal, who went to the International Podcast Day last year in September, and I spoke to them, and I said, okay, I'm going to talk with Dave. If there is any question that you want to put in or stuff like that, and the question base, it's now we are saying, as you spoke already, lots of people creating podcasts, but how many of the coronavirus podcasts or quarantine created podcasts will be able to proceed and continue as we going to return to our works, return to our daily routine? Because now I have time, I can be here all day long, if I want, creating content and stuff like that. But when I go to work in the car and stuff like that, will I be able to continue creating content?
I think the big thing with what's going on in podcasting, the coronavirus, is it's simply a matter of convenience for them to get into podcasting. There are a lot of people that will continue to podcast, but not related to coronavirus. We've been seeing, as I mentioned, a lot of fiction-based podcasts, a lot of storytelling podcasts, entertainment podcasts that have popped up that are going to be continuing post-coronavirus pandemic, where I know, for example, there's 3 news stations in my local city that I live in that started podcasts simply to talk about the local impact of coronavirus on our community. What's happening with businesses, what's going on at the local level, what's going on at the state level. Once this thing is done, those news outlets are going to be done podcasting. So I think you're seeing a large splash, right? We said 91,000 just in the month of April. You're going to see slowly a number of those, like as you said, come July, August, September, as people ramp up to their what used to be their normal routine, their normal life before coronavirus. If you don't have the time, if you don't have the effort, if you don't have the energy, and you don't have the passion to keep it going, you're simply going to drop off. We know that those corona pandemic ones are, unless they shift their focus and change into more of a public health vision, or if they change it into talking about some other, some other idea or concept, those are clearly going to dry out because there's a short lifespan. So I think, whereas we saw this massive increase, I think it was just a matter of convenience. People wanted to podcast. They had the time now, so let's go ahead and do it. And as I can't agree with you more that as people start to get busy, as they start getting back to driving in their vehicles, getting back to work full time, if they're no longer doing their now emergency sort of way of life, a lot of these are going to fall off the table. But I know for a lot of those that wanted to get into it, didn't quite have the time, it's going to take some adjustment. But I think overall, a lot of those could be successful. And as long as they continue to focus on their audience and they focus on their message that they want to send and what they're creating, they're going to have a lot of success, because I don't think it's any different. You can start a podcast in the middle of the corona pandemic. You can start it in 2009 when the last global sort of economic thing happened. Podcasting got through that too, and we continued to grow from it. And so I think this pandemic right now isn't that much different than what we've seen in like 2008 and some other like ups and downs throughout the years.
Mm-hmm. Portanto, aquilo que eu gostava de dizer ao Dave era o facto de haver esta questão de agora temos muitas pessoas que, estando em casa, criam podcasts, mas até que ponto é que essas pessoas vão continuar a ter a capacidade de fazer esses mesmos podcasts, no sentido de quando nós voltarmos todos à nossa rotina normal, voltarmos a trabalhar, estarmos mais tempo no carro, estarmos a ter que ir, por exemplo, buscar filhos ao colégio, coisas assim, género. O que é que vai ser dos nossos próprios podcasts que nós criámos durante a quarentena? Vamos ter tempo? Não vamos ter tempo? E, portanto, vai haver aqui também muita filtragem nesse sentido, porque não é fácil manter um próprio podcast. E, portanto, são esse tipo de conteúdos que também é preciso termos aqui em atenção. So, tell me, I was podcasting in 2008. With the crisis, what happened to all the podcasts? Because when I was in 2008, I was like 13, 14 years old. So I don't have a podcast. I do not listen to podcasts. Even I do not know back then what was a podcast. So what happened back then?
Yeah, so in 2008 and 2009, we sort of had, domestically here in the United States, we had a really big financial crisis. And at the time, 2008, podcast was heavily isolated within the United States. We did have some international podcast happening, but for the most part, podcasting was only 4 to 5 years old at that time. And so the biggest impact we saw in 2008 and 2009 that we're going to see, and we are seeing right now, is mostly on those companies or the podcasts that relied heavily on advertising revenue. And I think that's where you're going to see the greatest impact, during the coronavirus and post, because as behaviors change, as listening habits have changed, you're already seeing advertisers, i.e. entertainment companies, you're obviously seeing like Instacart and some of these pre-prepped meals that are trying to get into the podcast game now, but you have a lot of companies that want to advertise on podcasts that are drawing back because they're having a 20 to 30% drop in their listener base of the podcast. And so I think the ones that are going to have the most impact now compared to 2008 and 2009 are those companies that relied on advertising revenue so heavily. What does it mean for the independent podcaster? Those ones that just, are getting small little advertising dollars from different people or just doing it just out of their own pocket. You're not going to see much impact, right? There's going to be no long-term effect on them. So overall, whereas you're going to see less companies bringing in less advertising revenue, which may mean less podcasts created, overall the space is going to move on and it's going to survive. There's very few players that are going to start 2020 than when they're going to end 2020. So, but I think overall numbers and the importance of these numbers of shows, really shows the growth and stability of the podcasting space. But to answer your question, mostly 2008, 2009, there was an economic downturn significant here in the US, and that really created an advertising revenue gap, which ended up closing up a lot of podcast companies, which ended up podcasters being out of work and having to find other means. And so I think you're seeing that not necessarily with the individuals like you and I, Claudio, that do it on the independent scale, that sort of cash roll our own thing, but the larger companies, you're going to see them sort of scaling back their shows, relieving some of their podcasters and producers of their employment, and just trying to sort of make ends meet and dollars meet at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. We are talking about football, soccer, and Manchester United has now a podcast. Political parties are creating also podcasts, so they be in touch with all the members and all the supporters. Why now I think we are getting closer to understand that the podcasts are the future of communication. A lot of things changed since the first time we met in September 2018, when I came to the International Podcast Day, talking about podcasting politics.
Yeah, there's been a definitely big shift. I mean, everybody tries to point at these different moments in time, right, Claudio, and say, oh, 2010 was a big year, 2014 was a big year, 2016. And we just have to be upfront and say things are constantly evolving and things are constantly growing in the podcasting industry. And there's been a continual increase. It says since September 2004, when the first podcast was released, we have seen continual increases, both on number of downloads, number of podcasts, and of course, different ways to listen to podcasts. I was looking at some stats earlier this week and noticed that smart speakers, right? A lot of us have smart speakers like a Google Home or an Amazon Alexa Echo device in their home. So these smart speakers, just in March alone, since everybody's been locked down and quarantined, we've seen a 30% increase in listening via smart speaker. And that was different because in February there was a -4. There's a negative drop in percentage of listening. And so, as you're saying, Claudio, yeah, podcasting is sort of the future media for conversation, for communication. And I think as different habits change and as people shift their listening behaviors, you're going to find that podcast is going to be the medium of choice for so many of us out there. And I know a lot of people that don't listen to news radio anymore. I know a lot of people that don't listen to news broadcast on cable television or anything like that. They're going to podcasts first. They're going to YouTube for some videos and information on that. And so you're exactly right. Even since we met only 18 months ago, that we've had a really continual shift into, I want to get my news from people that I trust. And that trust is coming from somebody that's in my ear, somebody that is doing their own diligent research and conversation with their experts and their understanding and their sort of diving into the different topics and policies. And so you're right, as things begin to shift, I think this coronavirus pandemic is changing that a little bit too, where people are wanting clear-cut answers on what's going on. And I think in podcasts, you can get that unfiltered sort of just, here's what my thought is on it. And I think that's pretty powerful.
Exato, portanto, aqui a fazer um recuo a 2008, né? 2008, 2009 foi uma grande crise que também tivemos, todos nós nos recordamos bem dessa altura, que nos levou inclusive à Troika. Just an appointment, Dave, back in 2009, 2010, Portugal was called for help from the IMF, the Central Bank of Europe and stuff like that, called the Troika. So it was a big crisis back then across the Europe. That's why I told you that sentence, like, if the US sneeze, Europe got a flu. E portanto estava aqui a dizer ao Dave esta frase que nós muitas vezes dizemos na política e na economia: se os Estados Unidos da América espirram, vem uma gripe para toda a Europa. Falava aqui então de que muitas vezes já poucas pessoas ouvem as notícias por televisão e portanto ouvem os podcasts de notícias, procuram ouvir, porque também querem que haja uma voz que eles conhecem, uma pessoa que eles vão confiando e, portanto, preferem ver isso, preferem alguém que faz o seu próprio trabalho de pesquisa e que está. Isto tem a ver também, obviamente, com o tipo de jornalismo que vamos tendo nos dias de hoje. E eu falava então também de que, obviamente que isto é uma realidade muito americana, o caso das Alexas, da Amazon, do Google, que tem sido um dos sítios onde mais se tem consumido os podcasts, ou seja, aquilo está em casa, portanto as pessoas pedem para que aquilo seja transmitido, portanto não através do telefone ou do computador, por exemplo, portanto através mesmo disto tem sido uma forma que os podcasts têm estado a fazer bastante companhia. Dave, do you have any tips like you want to give to our listeners? So, and all the podcasts, because I think this episode is more for the podcasters than even for the listeners, just if they have the curiosity of knowing what is podcasting and stuff like that. But I think this content, it's more to all the podcasters who may listen to this.
Yeah, first, I do want to speak to the listeners and audience out there. You know, we're seeing a lot of information right now that says, like, you know, numbers are down and downloads are down, and, you know, some podcasters, either independent or the company, are beginning to struggle. And I do want to encourage everybody that's listening to your podcast and is just to continue to support them, continue to download, continue to share that message with the people that you are going to know that this message is going to be valuable to them, is because, yes, it's kind of hard to kind of predict where podcasting is going to look like. Maybe we'll find out really within a year post-coronavirus how this really all plays out. But really, it's up to the listener and the audience out there to continue to download, continue to support in whatever means that is. If that's sharing the message, if that's writing reviews, if that's taking part in one of their sponsors to keep them moving. I think that's one of the most important parts, Claudio. I want to make sure the audience understands that this media moves forward as just as important as a podcast host as it is for the audience. It's all of our jobs to make sure we push this medium further and further as we can go. So for the podcasters out there, if you're considering starting one, make sure you're just not doing it because it's an opportunistic time. Just remember, 91,000 other podcasts started in April. We have 1 million in there. So the space is really crowded right now. So you don't want to just simply dive in because it's opportunistic, that it's just now is the time because I have some free will and some free time. Like you said, Claudio, once people start getting back to their routines, they're going to find it very difficult to continue this. And so start for the right reasons. Continue to create a show that is valuable, that has really good information and is backed by knowledge and information, and make sure you're sharing all of that information with your audience so that they know it's real and authentic. Most important, Claudio, and I think this is one thing that actually dooms podcasters a lot, is you have to stick with that consistent schedule. If anything that I've said during our conversation is that everything's based on a listener's behavior. How are they acting? What are they doing? Where are they going? Gyms are closed, so you can't work out there. You know, you have to deliver a consistent, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, every month, every 4 days, whatever it is, you need to make sure you stick with that schedule, because that is going to show your audience that they matter, you matter to them, and they matter to you. And so do it for the right reasons, create something that is valuable and is going to be very useful for people, and also create that consistent schedule. And of course, reach out to Claudio, who's more than willing to help out. Reach out to anybody in the podcasting space. They're going to help you with the tools and the tricks. And one thing, Claudio, that I've learned working with my father podcasting for over 10 years is that we have our own strengths, right? I'm really good at researching and writing. My father, Steve, he is really good at the technical side. He does all the editing. He does all the website work. And so find somebody or work on your set of skills particularly. You know, once I start getting into audio editing and running the website, that's when things sort of fall apart on that side. And when Steve starts doing the writing and those things, it falls apart it's just you have to have an honest evaluation of what your skills are as a podcaster and how you can make your role successful. And so those are a few little tidbits that I'd pass along for podcasters. And that goes for people that are currently podcasting as well. It's just not for new people. These are things that, you know, as just like when we work in our regular 8 to 5 jobs, Claudio, we always learn how to adapt, and we learn new things, and we change, and we get reassigned, and we have new workloads. Same thing with podcasting. It's going to shift. You have to be adaptable in a lot of those different ways.
Yeah. So just tell me one thing. I think I'm figuring it out just right now. Is Steve, your dad, one of the hosts of the International Podcast Day?
Yes. Yeah. My dad.
Oh.
Yep.
I did not realize.
Oh yeah. Steve.
Back then. Now I know.
Yeah. And yeah, we've been podcasting since March 1st, 2007.
He's a nice guy.
Yeah, great guy. And we complement each other a lot, not only on our podcast, but on the International Podcast Day side too. So yeah, we're father-son, and we've been doing this for a number of years. So yeah, it's surprising how many people know we're father and son. It's also just as surprising how many people don't realize that we're father and son. It's always a fun conversation to have when people are like, wait, you guys are related just like right now. It's kind of, you kind of look back, you're like, wait a minute, how did I not see that?
Yeah, it was the first time in the back 2018, and your father hosted me like, okay, so I'm going to tell you all the things going to do, what you have to say, what you don't have to say, what you mustn't say, and stuff like that. And I said, okay, I recognize the background, but okay, maybe it's like, okay, they are going all to an house with the same computer, and they do like changing all the time and stuff like that. But I did not realize it was your father. So
yeah, he has a studio up where he lives, and so it's only 45 minutes from where I live, and so we podcast remotely. I'm in my town, he's in his town, but for the International Podcast Day event, we're in the same house for 36 hours working and planning, and so we're in the studio up there. But yeah, it's a fun story, and we love to work together. And again, that's another little sort of bit of advice I can give podcasters and those that are getting into it is you got to find someone you can work with. You know, you're going to have to find somebody that you work with well, understanding and knowing that there's going to be some disagreement. And it's just not like like an easy friendship or an acquaintance you can just break off and say, okay, we're done. You got to find someone you can work with collectively, that you can have those moments where you disagree on where your show goes or a format or where the direction of your show needs to go. Just understanding it's no different than anything else. You have to work collectively, collaboratively, and you have to be smart about who you choose to work with.
Yeah, I will get back to you, just translate now. Portanto, estivemos aqui a falar de dicas, porque obviamente acredito que este episódio esteja a ser tradicionalmente mais visto por podcasters do que propriamente vocês, caros ouvintes, que queiram verdadeiramente saber as coisas todas dos podcasts, no sentido mais inside stories, mais de componente de estatística. Mas ele falar justamente que é preciso manter o andamento, portanto, manter a questão de se é uma vez por semana, se é 2 vezes por semana, se é mais ou menos tempo. Isso é o que importa também perceber aqui nesta componente. Assim sendo, é isso que ele diz. Está que ter também a capacidade de pedirmos ajuda a quem mais sabe, portanto, ele dizer que se quisessem pedir-me ajuda, obviamente estou mais que disponível para tal, mas é justamente isto. E acabei agora mesmo de descobrir que já tinha falado também com o pai do Steve, do Dave, o Steve neste caso, em que justamente you are smiling. I believe you just understand, like, okay, Steve now is telling that he realized that we are father and son.
Yeah, I can hear it. I can hear it.
E portanto é isso que tem ocorrido. So now, Dave, we were talking like have someone with us and stuff like that. You know, I have a podcast about tennis, and I have with 2 other colleagues, and it's good because all of 3 we have a different perspective about the game. For instance, I do play tennis, but I'm more like the history guy. One of our other guys, he played, and one is a coach. So 3 different perspectives about the same game. And that gets better when I support like Nadal, the other guy, Roger Federer, and the other guy more like Federer or Djokovic. It depends of the game. So that's good. I think the podcasts who have 2 or 3 hosts, if the hosts work together, like they create a good dynamic, even if they disagree, like, okay, I believe it's more possible to do in politics, sports, and movies and series, because, okay, I prefer this character, I prefer this player, I prefer this candidate, stuff like that, who can do a good dynamics. But there is not always easy to have a co-host in this case. You know, I work alone in this podcast about politics, and also alone in my cycling podcast. So it's not, people sometimes say, okay, I have to create a podcast, but I have to create with someone else. And I say all the time, like, if you want to create your own podcast, you don't have to trouble with that. And another question is about getting or not getting to the YouTube. You know, I started this podcast in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also YouTube. So I do the video stuff since ever. And in the beginning, there was like lots of podcasters say, no, that's not a podcast, that's a video cast. And I respond to them like, okay, videocast is those guys who are afraid to turn on the camera and don't want to do a little bit more edition. Because now I see many of podcasts going to the YouTube, even those who criticized me back then.
Yeah, YouTube is has a very interesting role in podcasting. It has a really interesting role. Obviously, YouTube is being completely centered on the creator of that content, right? The publisher of that material, and they've always been very supportive. And of course, they have their terms and service that you have to comply with, XYZ. But you know what? I think YouTube can be a very accessible tool and a very good tool. We have to remember that YouTube is the second most popular browser out there. Behind Google as a web browser, there's YouTube, and then you get into the other ones like Mozilla and Bing and Firefox and all those other ones. So YouTube is the number 2 search engine in the entire world. So why would you, as a podcaster, not want to utilize that tool? Everybody's going to Google already. A lot of people are going to different web browsers and search engines to find information about what their interest is, whether it's tennis, whether it's cycling, whether it's football, whether it's politics, whether it's health and fitness, well-being, whatever it is. Why wouldn't you use a platform like that? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be like, Claudio, you do video on YouTube. I know there's a lot of podcasters that simply just use tools like repurpose.io, which takes your audio file and simply repurposes it into a YouTube video. Yes, it's not as it's dynamic. It has a background. It has some information, but it's just simply sort of a screenshot with your podcast audio in the background. And so why wouldn't you want to utilize a tool like that? You may, I like Claudio, you have a great production, you have a great setup, all those different things. There's a lot of podcasters that do. It doesn't have to be the top notch. It just has to be, It has to be good quality. You don't want to embarrass yourself by having a really poor quality of a video or presentation on there. But I don't have a problem. Like, the only thing I have a problem with is if you start your podcast on YouTube and you call it a podcast. There's some dynamics around the definition of what makes a podcast, and that's to get in the weeds. We don't need to do that. But if you want to be on YouTube as just an outlet for you, make sure you do that. I don't see any problem with that. So of course, make sure you have your website built out. You want to use that. Make sure you're using your podcast player apps. Make sure your show is everywhere, and just include YouTube as just another avenue for people to hear about you. But make sure your product on YouTube looks good, has good quality, and that you continue to go there to make sure you're not missing comments, that you're refreshing it, and those things. So I think YouTube is a great resource. Second most used search engine in the world. Why would you want to ignore that as a potential resource for you as a creator?
That's nice. That's nice because I try to not obligate the people who are listening coming to the video. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to dance on the video because that will force the people who are listening to go to the YouTube and see Claudio's dancing. So I have my setup, I have my books and stuff like that. This roll up also. So it's very important to have that stuff. But I see some guys like doing a lot of shows on the YouTube, and I feel like the YouTube channel is more richer than the audio, like the part in the Apple Podcast or Spotify. So I think you have to make a balance.
You do. You have to remember that wherever you want to grab the most amount of your audience is where you need to perfect that, right? If you want to stick with audio, make sure your audio is really good. If you're looking to create a video production and that to be your number one landing spot for your audience and for your listeners, make sure you improve on that. A lot of podcasters, we want to make sure we have the best audio quality possible because we know that's what people want. You have to understand that YouTube is only going to be a portion of your listener base. You're only a certain percentage, a small percentage of your audience, if you start out as an audio-only podcast, is going to go to YouTube. It's just a fact. The numbers back that up. So make sure you don't overindulge or overinvest in YouTube unless that's the future of where you want to take your material. And if you want to stick with audio, awesome. That's a great medium. As you mentioned, Claudio, it's the next wave of how we're going to communicate, how we're going to get information. At the end of the day, use YouTube, but only use it to the greatest extent you feel like you need to serve your audience the best.
Yeah, because the YouTube can make you go like below and comment and interact more with someone when you are at Spotify. Because at Spotify, you can only listen. You cannot report. You cannot comment. You cannot do anything. So you must go to the Facebook page, Instagram page, or Twitter page of your podcast, or mailing. Now we are all talking about creating WhatsApp groups and stuff like that. Like it was a mail deliver. No, it's not the time. It's the term. It's the newsletter. So not a newsletter by email, but by WhatsApp.
Yeah, see, WhatsApp is growing in popularity. Not so much here in the United States, but I know a lot of international podcasters are using it to spread the word of their message, to share guests and information, and it's a great way to create a community of listeners and create that community of audience members. And it's a great tool. It's a fantastic tool. Like you said, audio has its limitations, so video and YouTube, that platform, provides a lot of positives. Like you said, comments, interaction, likes. Not all podcast players can do that. So yeah, you have to find a way to utilize those in tandem to make sure that you're reaching all your audience members. And the last thing you want to do is be ignoring comments and not replying, and that's not helpful. If you ignore your YouTube page, you're also ignoring your members who are commenting and liking your information. So that's most important as well. And I think that just goes in general with emails, or when people ask, when you reach out for your audience to ask questions, last thing you want to do is not answer somebody's question, on the podcast. You want to make sure that everybody has been engaged and everybody feels like their voice matters on your podcast.
Exatamente, portanto, estivemos aqui a falar desta componente toda de haver podcasts no YouTube, se são ou se não são podcasts. Enfim, este podcast começou desde o início também no YouTube, portanto, sempre com o Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube também. O Dave a dizer aqui que o YouTube é o segundo maior motor de busca, portanto, atrás da Google, e, portanto, por que não também colocares lá o teu conteúdo, por que não também, ao fim e ao cabo, fazeres lá chegar, de forma que as pessoas te ouçam. E é uma coisa que eu sempre disse há muito tempo, que é, as pessoas devem ouvir-te onde elas quiserem. Portanto, não me interessa a mim encaminhar-te a ti único e exclusivamente para o YouTube, ou único e exclusivamente para o Spotify, ou único e exclusivamente para o Apple Podcasts. Deve estar em todo o lado, até porque tens outras plataformas como o Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Castbox, enfim, existem todas outras aplicações que tu podes ouvir. Agora lá está, foi o que o Dave estava a dizer também, que se estás no YouTube, então tens que dar atenção a essas pessoas. E obviamente que agora uma coisa que tem sido crescente, pelos vistos não tanto nos Estados Unidos, é a questão de grupos de WhatsApp dos vários podcasts que são colocados. So, Dave, for starting to ending this episode, let's just put a Portuguese touch of this. So I know there is a restaurant near of you which is Portuguese. So tell me about.
Yeah, the Portuguese restaurant near us, near me.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's at least one good one that I've been to. The most memorable one that I have is when my wife went and got married a few years ago. We went up a little bit north, and it was this little gem that was just inside of this small little town, little community center, and I'd never had authentic Portuguese wine or food or anything like that. And it was one of the best meals I had had in years, and it was fantastic. I can't really remember off the top of my head exactly what I had. It was definitely, I had a meat dish, and I think there was some sort of potato on the side, but I had like 2 or 3 different Portuguese wines. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I never tasted anything like that, because I mean, I enjoy wine, and it's I've had a few from like Argentina and some from France, and some just domestically here, where I'm actually only 2 hours away from a large winery area on the central coast of California, and so we get to explore a lot of that. But yeah, just a fantastic experience. The ambiance and the structure of the restaurant was great, and both the server and the owner were able to come over and talk to us about the menu and kind of share
the owner
meaning.
Is Portuguese?
Yeah. And so it was a really great experience. I loved it. We can't wait to go back. It's about 2 hours up the road from us, but it's something that I definitely hold near and dear to my heart. It was part of our wedding anniversary trip that we took, and at the time I didn't know you. I didn't know much about Portugal or Portuguese food, so it's been good to kind of dive into it and really enjoy that.
Yeah, it is cheap or not to go to that restaurant, comparing to others like French restaurants, Italian restaurants, stuff like that.
Oh, how does it compare?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually really good. I wish I could go more. It's a little bit out of the ways from us, but I would say I definitely enjoy Italian food, not necessarily all the pastas, but I like their chicken, their fish, and a lot of different ways they prepare a lot of those different things. But Portuguese, it's right up there, man. I wish there was a local, a more regional local restaurant for me to go try more things, because I'd love to bounce ideas off you and kind of get an idea. But yeah, it definitely ranks up there with one of my better dining experiences when it comes to international food.
Yeah, we Portuguese, we have a great community in Newark, which is in the north of New York.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's in the northeast part of the United States. Yeah.
So if you go there, I believe you have plenty of Portuguese materials so you can buy.
Yeah, maybe once the United States kind of opens up and we can fly cross country and things start to quiet down, it'll be a chance for us to kind of explore and try some new places. My wife and I really enjoy to explore like the northwestern part of the United States, in Seattle, the state of Washington, state of Oregon, and California. And so when we go out, I definitely have it on my list to try and find some other Portuguese-based and inspired restaurants and foods. So
yeah, there you can find it, because that community, most of them come from Azores. So which is a military base for you Americans.
My dad was in the military, and him and my mom were stationed at the Azores. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. That was probably in 76, maybe he was out there, 1976. Yeah, he was stationed out there. He was in the Air Force for 21 years.
Yeah. Well, that stays as U.S. military bases today, so it's good. But when this coronavirus stops, maybe you can book a trip to Portugal, and I can show you the country.
Oh, that'd be great. Once this thing lifts, I think there's a lot of possibilities for a lot of us to kind of get back to our normal routine and visit some people that we enjoy to hang out with. So yeah, thank you for having me on, Claudio. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's the podcast spirit. I think is this what I think is the most important between us podcasters is sharing all the stuff. And thank you, Dave and Steve, also for creating this International Podcast Day, which is very important. Who can merge a lot of podcasts and share all the type of cultures. I noticed that, for instance, that girl from Thailand just got married, something Lopes, if I'm not.
Yeah.
She was like storytelling.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
Podcast.
The name escapes me right now, but yeah, it's great.
She went like 3 times or something like that into International Podcast Day.
Was it Isa?
2 or 3. Isa Lopes.
Isa, yes. Yep.
Isa Perez, Lopes, I don't know now.
Yeah, it used to be Isa Perez, but yeah.
Isa Perez, yes.
Yep. Yeah, she's great. She's been on our show, our event a couple times, and yeah, great young woman. I heard she got married. She took over a family business. It's so incredible. If you would have told me, like 3 years ago that I've been talking to people in Thailand and different parts of Europe, and Claudio being on your show and talking to people in New Zealand and Africa, and it's been a wild ride, but it just shows you, just as you said, the power of voice and the power of community. And once you have that connection, it doesn't matter how far you are apart, whether that's 3 miles or 3,000 miles. It's you have a common interest and you have a common goal to push things forward. And I think that's ultimately what it comes. It doesn't matter, as I said, if you're a podcaster in Portugal, Spain, France, South Africa, Ghana. We're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to share our stories. We're trying to share our insights. And I think that's ultimately where this medium thrives compared to a lot of other ones.
Muito bem. Portanto, aquilo que nós falamos porque já em conversas passadas, inclusive até no International Podcast Day, o Dave tinha falado de um restaurante português, e, portanto, do quanto ele tinha também gostado da comida portuguesa, e, portanto, por que não, agora também, quando esta coisa toda do coronavírus acabar, que ele possa vir também a Portugal, e, portanto, ele também quer conhecer mais a cultura portuguesa também, daí eu estar-lhe a falar também da comunidade que nós temos em Newark, que é a comunidade que maioritariamente vem dos Açores. O pai do Dave conheceu a mãe do Dave também na base militar dos Açores em 1966, portanto, muita coisa aqui a ligar. So, Dave, thank you very much for being in my show. It's an honor to be with you. It's a nice friendship who I have through this podcast. It's very nice to be. So, it's like 6:30 p.m. here and there. In California.
Yeah, it is 10:35 a.m. So yeah, nothing better than podcasting 8 hours apart.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. My day is ending and your day is starting. So what a better way to start your day with Claudio.
Exactly. Yeah, but I can't thank you so much for having me on. It was a blast to talk about podcasting, and yeah, hope everyone's still staying safe out there. Hope everybody's family and friends and loved ones are staying healthy and following the rules. But yeah, thank you so much, Claudio. It was a blast to kind of sit back and let loose and talk about where we are in the podcast space, but also kind of reach out to listeners and audience and podcasters and kind of talk about what we can do to kind of get through this and what we can do to find a lot of support through these very strange, weird times.
Muito bem, portanto o Dave aqui também a despedir-se e portanto eu despeço-me também agora. I'm going to say goodbye to the audience now, Dave. Portanto, caros ouvintes, obrigado e até lá, já sabem, tenham boas conversas e mantenham-se seguros. Um abraço.